Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm happy to see all of you. Some of the similar names that were here yesterday, Brooke, Catherine, Deidre. So welcome again to part 2 of our webinar for how to actually use the UDL toolkit. My name is Josh Joseph. I'm a disability specialist here in the Office of Education. I'm happy to have here 2 other presenters who will be presenting today as well. You want to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Rebecca Rhodes. I'm the team lead for reading and literacy at Aid Washington.
I'm Ann Hayes. I'm a consultant and I'm the lead author on the toolkit.
Great. Just some brief information. The voice that you're actually hearing today, I'm a man and there's a woman's voice. It's a little confusing, but she's our sign language interpreter and she'll be interpreting for me today. So that's the voice that you heard for me. Before we start, I wanted to summarize a few important points from yesterday's webinar. I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. How this toolkit is structured, it actually has 4 chapters. The first chapter is related to introduction to the UDL and actually how reading literacy is defined. Chapter 2 is related to the holistic support. Chapter 3 is the phases of literacy, instruction technology, and using that UDL. And the last chapter is 4, and that's theory changed into practice. So yesterday we actually covered chapter 1, 2, and 4. Today we're going to cover chapter 3. Plus we'll actually have another session related to how to implement this toolkit. Yesterday we discussed multiple paths of engagement, representation, and expression, a little bit about education and what's included and what it looks like in the school environment, and also some specifics for inclusion. We also talked about the role of the teachers, families, community, and reasonable accommodations. We also talked about the twin tracks, that approach, and from top down and from bottom up, disability targeted programs and disability inclusion, that program. And of course, we talked about social model for disability and why that's so very important. Right now, we're going to go ahead and dive into this. It's very meaty, it's very bulky of the UDL toolkit, and it's related to how that we're actually going to encourage literacy for children with disabilities. I want to emphasize again that you need to focus on children with disabilities, but again, this technology can be applied to children without disabilities as well. It can improve their reading too. So now in this session, we're going to discuss understanding literacy and disability and how that matches each disability, and understanding what the meanings are and how to identify their students and the needs in the classroom, and how that process is for qualifying for services, how that works. The third one is how can we tailor instruction for each level for the literacies in the classroom, at different age levels, and then different examples of how we can support different disabilities and their unique needs. And again, how to really look at how those supports can apply to other children as well. And lastly, how we can actually analyze their different literacy needs. The first part, wanting to understand reading and literacy and disability. There's 3 actually parts to this. So the first one is very important. Intervene as early as possible. And what that really means is we know that children in general they start school by primary age, maybe 6 years old. But before that, in some countries, they do have some educational opportunities before 6 years old, but in the country that we work in, many do not have that in their system, at the system level. So children at home, many people will assume that these children are getting appropriate language development at home before 6, and that language is very, very important. It's a precursor to the fundamentals of reading and literacy skills after 6. So parents, when they read and engage with their children, we can assume that that does happen at home, but by the time children do get to school, then they should be ready to start learning, but often that does not happen. So it's really important to make sure that parents are aware what they need to do and how to engage with their child based on other forms of early childhood development programs, and to make sure that they're included in that and children are on the right benchmarks for language and literacy, both. The next one is core literacy principles. We've already discussed yesterday at the webinar. Again, you can actually go back and look at the toolkit because it has specifics in there, but we want to emphasize that it's similar principles that do apply to everything in this session. And next, we want to dispel some of the myths that people still believe, and we need to dissolve those. The myths, some of these myths, as you can see, there's some examples. Many people think that learning reading in the classroom is immediate, and it just is, but it's not the case. There's actually things that have to happen before you go in the classroom. Like you need to have language, you need to have intentionality with these students, and link language with different letters and then the words and make those connections. Many people believe that all learners are the same. All children with disabilities learn the same way, and really that is not the case. We all have different needs, different learning styles as well. We have disabilities, and some can or can't do certain things, but they actually can match with different learning styles. And it can become complex. So we actually need to make sure that we do the UDL framework, look at that, because it actually provides many different ways that we can express and receive information, motivate students to learn. And many of them will think, oh, that cognitively, with the critical period where acquisition of language is early on, if they miss that critical period, then sometimes they say, oh, it's just too late. They can't acquire language literacy skills. And that's not true. They can still learn at the same level as if it impact all other children. No, but they can still learn. Many believe that if they're deaf and hard of hearing, or they have intellectual disabilities, maybe deaf blind, multiple disabilities, that they're called more severe disabled. And it's too hard, they can't learn, they can't read and write, but really that's not the case. Many of them still can. They can read and write just as much as anyone else without disabilities. I mean, look at Helen Keller, for example. I mean, wow, she's a beautiful writer. And so, yes, they still can. One other myth that I wanted to mention is, and it actually relates to the next part, is related to diagnosis and that sphere of identification screening. Many people believe that you must identify or diagnose and that this certain disability before they give any kind of services, or before they do any kind of programming. But really, that's not the case. You can actually provide services to meet the students' learning needs without a diagnosis. And you can go ahead and do these educational programs, and you can build on that with different kinds of supports that are needed for this student without doing a screening, identification, or a diagnosis process. Both of us actually encourage you, if you feel like, oh, I have to pick one or the other, or I feel like I can't manage both, don't worry about the diagnostic and the screening part. What's really important is to focus on what kind of supports that you can provide in the classroom and lead this student to be able to have their learning outcomes be met. The identification, the screening process, that's a whole different track, and yes, it's related to it, but it's still separate, and it's going to take longer if that's what you're focused on. So, Anne, we're going to go ahead and have you go next, and you can explain more about identification, diagnosis, and screening, and what that actually looks like. So go ahead, Anne. Thanks.
Great. So as Josh said, this is a really complicated issue and something that people are most interested often. What's hard to know is that, as Josh said, a diagnosis is not needed to support children. What's more important is to really focus on those supports and diversifying teaching to support all kids in the classroom versus putting a label on a child. So really what the purpose, it's not to say identification isn't needed or it shouldn't be done, it's just it's very complex. And it's going to take a long time to build those systems in countries that are starting from very little. The main thing is that the purpose of identification is to see what that child needs, what supports they need, how you can improve their learning. It is not to simply label a child, or what's happened in many places, it's then used to label a child and justify removing that child from the classroom, putting them in a segregated school, or often worse, sometimes not even having school because they're seen as having a severe disability. Identification is an ongoing process. To do it well, you need many different sort of layers, many different culturally normed tools. Often those don't exist. Too often we use tools from the United States and just merely translate them into the language without seeing how they translate culturally. They need to have multidisciplinary teams that often include speech therapists, occupational therapists, individuals that often are not available yet in the classrooms in which we work. Parents should be involved through everything, and when done right, it's a long process. It can happen over, 4 to 6 months, and hopefully it is done in the school setting. So looking at the children in classroom, playgrounds, and all different types of school settings. So what we recommend is a phased approach. Now, and this is a little bit of a nuance. It is important to screen for vision and hearing. And screening for vision and hearing can be done in the classroom setting, but that's different than testing or diagnosing. So just imagine I myself have contacts on. I did a vision screening, I failed, I then went to a doctor, they figured out what glasses I need and said, this is your prescription. That's a screening test is done. That's same thing for low hearing. You can say this child has low hearing, then they go to a doctor and they say, okay, they have low hearing or they're hard of hearing because they have reoccurring ear infections that could be treated, or they may not, and this is something of which we need to give long-term supports. So we do think that you can start with doing a universal screening in hearing. Too often, people only do screenings for those they suspect have vision and hearing, but most kids don't recognize they have vision and hearing. They're very good at sort of not showing their needs. It's really those top 2 areas on the pyramid here that become very complex. The one is once you have the vision and hearing screening, some kids will continue to struggle in the classroom. Sometimes that reason for struggling can be because of poverty. It could be because they're hungry. It could be because of learning disabilities. It could be because they see reoccurring abuse or are being abused at home. When people use checklists or try to simplify this system, the problem is that those things all look the same. The signs are very similar. So you can't, by a checklist, really see if someone has dyslexia versus they're hungry. So there's a method that's preferred, and it's called response to intervention. And when done well, it takes about 6 months. And we talk about that in the toolkit. I won't go into that now. But through that, you can see when doing intensified language instruction, who does better and who continues to struggle. The ones that continue to struggle, those are given a comprehensive evaluation by a multidisciplinary team. And again, it doesn't lead to a diagnosis. It leads to what that individual child needs. I can say, for example, I have dyslexia, and I probably wouldn't be caught with a checklist. And for my evaluation, it really was that I needed support in math. If people just used it as a screening and then said all people with dyslexia need the same supports, the supports for reading wouldn't apply to me. And if they put me in remedial reading, that also wouldn't apply to me. So I think it's really looking at individualized. Going back to what Josh said, the importance here is building those supports and very, very carefully moving forward. Because if we come in and we do this rushed, or if we use poor methods, we can either underrepresent or overrepresent children with disabilities in the classroom. And because of those associated stigmas, that can, in many cases, lead to harm for children. when there are such negative stigmas for disability. And if we're calling them, saying this child has this disability or that disability without giving them supports, there's really no benefit. So going back to Josh, you don't need to diagnose, and you don't need, you can start building these approaches in a thoughtful way. So this is, again, the sort of trying to understand this difference between identification and diagnostics. First, you screen, and that can be done with teachers, community workers. It's just kind of a very simple method. And then you evaluate, and that's the multidisciplinary team. That's where you get sort of more the individualized supports. If you can't do individualized supports, that's okay. You can still just do broad supports, like providing UDL in a classroom, doing diversification of teaching. The diagnosis, that's done by qualified specialists or medical experts. That is not a school-related service. This is where the need for health, the medical and the education system to kind of intertwine. But you'll also notice that parents are throughout this entire process. And this is often something that we disengage families, because they're the ones that can give us insight to rule out those external factors, to also give history of sort of where that illness or where they were as toddlers. So really parent and family engagement is key. So I know this is a very complex issue, but if I were just to leave on a few things, the importance here is services and supports, looking at what you're doing currently in the country, and then how do you build up those supports in a thoughtful, systematic way that doesn't harm children. So next, what we're really going to talk about for literacy, and Rebecca will talk from here.
Okay, great to see everybody's names today. While we're moving into this next section, which is about the actual organization of the instruction in the classroom, I'd really appreciate it if you could type into the chat box just one question you might have about the teaching part of working on building literacy skills with children with disabilities. Any question that you have about teaching children with disabilities in the classroom setting, please go ahead and type it in the chat box. From Catherine, creative ways of providing support in low resource settings, so really important. What about these low resources? From Leah, we've got how much extra time and capacity are we asking, do we need to provide for teachers so that they can use the UDL principles in the classroom? So that's a great question. And we'll try to get to these questions, and if you have more of them, go ahead and type them in. But we do intend to keep asking you to use the chat boxes, so just to be aware of that, because it's our main way of communicating here with you. So just to quickly touch on the 3 principles of the Universal Design for Learning framework, what we're talking about here is having enough multiple means of representation, communication, and engagement in the classroom so that every child can participate in the learning that's happening there. And that's really the key to making sure that your learning is as inclusive as possible. And what's comforting is that for us as education experts, these aren't fantastically new ideas. This isn't something none of us has ever thought of before in the sector. But the question is, how much more space do we need to make? It's really like Leah's question. How much more do we need to do to multiply those modalities so that every child is able to build his or her skills? So your toolkit, which we're very much selling here on this webinar, includes information on instructional supports for students who are blind and low vision, have communication disabilities, are deaf or hard of hearing, have intellectual disabilities and complex support needs, have learning, emotional, and attention disabilities, and have multiple disabilities. So you all need to silently thank Anne, who worked really hard to make sure that this chapter 3 of the toolkit covers many, many, many of the cases that your teachers or your systems in the field might encounter. So, and again, this isn't a thought you've never had. When we're talking about teaching children with disabilities to become literate and numerate, we're talking about tailoring their instruction by their stage of literacy acquisition. And your toolkit mentions 3, and I know all of you ed specialists are going to say, yes, but there are rubrics that go to as many as 12 stages. No, we're just going to work with 3 here for the minute with the toolkit. So obviously you have these 3 stages that you're bringing your child with disabilities through in terms of their literacy acquisition, just as you would any child. And this gets back to Josh's point about how the things that we're speaking of here aren't specific only to children with disabilities. It's how do you take all the good knowledge you have about what good education is and apply a disability lens. That's what the UDL framework allows you to do. So you have your learner, and your learner is going to pass through these stages of building a foundation and then their early emergent literacy, and then hopefully a stage 3 that's a more progressive version of literacy acquisition. So you're tailoring by stage, but you're also tailoring by disability. And so for each of these stages, there are instructional techniques that can be used with all students and that you want to encourage to be used with all students. And then there are some certain things that you might want to do based on the certain type of disability that a child may or may not have. And so you need to remember as well that there may be in your student population a few students who really do acquire their literacy skills very differently from what your teachers have typically been habituated to working with. And these students may need some specially designed instruction or supports. So if you just start from that foundational principle of knowing your child and knowing both their abilities and then holding high expectations for them, and I'm going to talk about that a little more in the future, then you look at your modalities and you try to be sure that you have that multiple means of communication, engagement, and representation so that each child can progress through the stages of literacy acquisition. So again, talking about these different skills, we do want to think first in the biggest terms about the importance skills for all children, right? And you have some examples in your toolkit. So obviously for all children in literacy instruction, these are things in the slide you see here in the first row. These are things that you need all children to know how to do, and you should expect all children to know how to do. And the best evidence that we have in this field is that if you keep your expectations high and you vary your modalities and you vary your child's experiences and you vary the ways in which they are able to engage with the content and skills that you're presenting, then you are providing them the best educational service that you can. What you do not want to do is lower expectations. That's going to hold your learner back, and it's going to create more problems than any kind of resolutions. So you want to look at the skills that all children need to have, and you want to say, absolutely, every child needs to have these skills, and we're going to get every child there. Then your toolkit breaks out for you what is listed in the toolkit as additional skills for children who may need one of those other multiple modalities. So the examples in the toolkit revolve around things like additional skills for children who use Braille, and you can see those listed on your slide, or additional skills for those who use sign language. But what we want you to also remember is that these skills aren't necessarily only beneficial for a child who is blind, low vision, or for a child who is deaf, hard of hearing. These skills that we've listed in the toolkit as additional could also potentially benefit any learner. And so we're not saying that every teacher in the world is going to be able to, between now and next year, in every elementary school around the world, know how to use Braille and know how to teach it to every child. But to the degree that possibilities present themselves for cross-teaching what we have listed as additional skills, even to the students who don't have a certain particular disability listed in that box in the toolkit, we really encourage that, because the more that there can be a give and take across these lines that we've drawn in the little boxes in our toolkits, the more that we can benefit the children. So again, this chapter 3 in the toolkit presents how to tailor literacy by stage of literacy acquisition, how to tailor instruction by stage of literacy acquisition and by a disability that a child may or may not have. And then it also takes the principles of universal design for learning and breaks them down and then lines up instructional techniques, selected ones, not every possible one ever, against that particular UDL principle. So if you refer to chapter 3 of the toolkit, if you're wondering, oh, what could I do so that there would be a greater multiplicity of means of action and expression in a certain classroom, there's a whole list in there. And on the slide, we've only given you some of those options, but there's a whole list in your toolkit of how you can bring each of the UDL principles to life through certain instructional techniques. And then, as if that weren't enough, there's also in chapter 3 an entire discussion of student assessment. And I love the whole toolkit, Anne, but I really want to thank you for presenting this part of the toolkit as well, because this is something that is really both new in most of our country contexts and also just fundamentally complex everywhere we go, right? Student assessment by nature is not easy. And so for children with particular needs in terms of the modes of expression or action or engagement that they have in the classroom, assessment becomes even more tricky for a teacher and something that they need to remember to know how to do or learn how to do, or somebody in the school needs to learn or know how to do. So this segment of the toolkit, I think, is a pretty rich contribution to how we can change what's happening in terms of assessing children who have disabilities. And I do want to remember to say that here we're talking about the kinds of assessment that you all know as the classic formative and summative assessment of skills acquisition and content mastery. We are not talking about, on this slide, the things that Anne talked about previously in terms of identifying a child who may or may not have a disability and of course this is something only medical professionals might do, diagnosing through a long 6-month evaluation process. That's not what this is about. This is about classic assessment in the core education sense of I'm a teacher, I had something I wanted children to learn, now I'm checking to see if they know it. And so the toolkit gives you many, many techniques for how, in terms of the modalities that you want to be enriching and varying under the Universal Design for Learning framework, you can actually adjust or teach teachers to adjust their assessment practices. So in terms of receiving information, which is something we often ask children to become very good at, and often we want to test if they can do it, and whole tests rely on being able to get information to a child who is receiving it in an appropriate way. There are lots of ways that a test can be modified so that a child with a disability can access that test and do the best he or she possibly could on it. Similarly, in terms of allowing children to respond to assessment protocols, there are lots of ways you can modify potential responses, and your toolkit lines up all of those for you. And obviously, in terms of just the core motivation of allowing a learner to have the confidence to attack, as we say in education, the test as best he or she can, there's a whole set of things you can do so that you don't have children with disabilities already saying to themselves before they've even tried to do a test item, oh no, this one's not for me, I know I can't manage this. So the toolkit is very rich on this particular point. And the last thing I want to say about this portion of the toolkit is that this information, although it's written in your toolkit vis-a-vis assessment, it's actually really useful to think about it in terms of just the basics of instruction on a day-to-day. I think everything that you see here on the slide and everything you'll read about in the toolkit is something that teachers, particularly those we're trying to teach to use backwards design processing, this is something you want to think of at the beginning of your planning and at the moment when you're making your lesson plans or you're making your chart for the week of what you're going to do. All of these things could play into being useful instructional supports for a class that were truly inclusive, that was really leveraging the Universal Design for Learning framework, that was really adopting all of the modalities that are necessary for each child to learn. These are things that we could really teach our teachers to use from the get-go and also in their assessment practices. So as if that weren't enough, for all of the things about instruction that are in Chapter 3 of the toolkit, we also have in Chapter 3 a set of do's and don'ts about instruction. And there are a couple of ways you could use that, right? You could, if you were inspired, use those do's and don'ts in Chapter 3 to make up a little chart for yourself of a classroom observation tool and kind of go out and watch what's happening in the classes where I am. How much of this do column do I see going on, and how much of this do not column do I see going on in terms of instruction? And that could become a really useful handhold to planning an intervention to change the literacy instruction for children with disabilities in your area. The toolkit is also full of lots of specific country and program examples. Anne and her team really worked hard to make sure that there were actual stories from actual places included in the toolkit. So if you go through and only read the text boxes with the country examples, you might get inspired about something you could do in your context. And then on page 167, again, to try to start unpacking how will we really do this teaching, there's a whole set of intervention ideas by learning challenge. So you might remember the first slide I presented was on the different disabilities that are addressed in the toolkit and all the different kinds of disability that the chapter breaks down into. The learning challenges on page 167 are then lined up against intervention ideas to try to help you understand from a programmatic perspective, oh, I'm thinking of actually building a program to help blind and low vision children. Oh, look, here's a set of learning interventions that I could actually sponsor and test in my context and see if they help. There's also in the toolkit a very extensive bibliography, so if you have nothing else to do at your USAID desk, just pick up the bibliography from the toolkit and read one of the books or articles that is cited. You will learn a lot about how to move forward in this area of instruction for children, literacy instruction for children with disabilities. Again, remembering that this isn't, the ideas and the core paradigms aren't entirely antithetical to all the things you've ever known or believed about education. What's new here is taking all those things we do understand are useful and helpful, and then putting a disability lens with that to be sure that we're reaching all of the children. And lastly, of course, your E3 Ed team, Josh, Leah, myself, anyone on this side is here to help if you have any questions about anything that you ever read in chapter 3 of the toolkit. So with all of that said, I'm actually going to go back to the questions that came into the chat. And so Leah, you raised the great query about how much extra time and capacity is this going to require of teachers. And I think that's going to vary quite a bit. What I think we're going to see, and I don't know because we haven't done a lot of work in this area yet as an agency, but I think what we're going to see is that teachers who are sort of well established in their own use of frameworks like Howard Gardner's multiple means of learning framework, where you learned your way of learning, whether you were a visual learner, an auditory learner, or a kinesthetic learner. Teachers who know things like this and who are already working with them in their classrooms are going to need less time and help in many cases to actually bring in the UDL multiple modes of communication, engagement, and motivation framework to try to see what they could do for children with disabilities in their environment. For other teachers, it's going to take a long time to even make a little bit of progress. And of course, as is true in every teacher training, for some teachers, they will never be able to do this. That's just true. Some teachers will not have the comfort level to be able to be this flexible and this child responsive in their instruction.
Rebecca, can I jump in real quick on that?
Sure.
So also just to say, what I've seen is that people are using some of this already. This is not a new concept. People are doing some sort of diversification. Often what I think is missing is the understanding of how to express yourself differently, because I typically see one teacher in front of a large classroom. But what I think is really, it's not so hard when you design a project with UDL from the very beginning. When you start doing scripted lessons plans that integrate UDL components, when you start really putting it into your materials, it becomes a key element of what you do, and it can be done very subtly. It is extraordinarily hard, like anything, to come in to a project that, especially a large early grade reading project, and try to integrate UDL once those materials are adapted.
Yeah.
So I think it's really, really not so challenging if you start thinking through a UDL lens in the beginning, but it will become extraordinarily costly if you have to come in and retrofit it. So I think that just to me shows the need for UDL from the get-go.
Right. And that point rejoins what Josh had said at the beginning of the webinar when he was talking about the fact that, you don't have to do the most world-class perfect screening and identification and diagnosis process to begin your work with Universal Design for Learning. You can design, as a USAID officer, you can design forward in Universal Design for Learning while you're still in the background trying to help your country understand the whole sort of package around the screening and the identification. So these two things can evolve simultaneously. So that's something that we wanted to contribute to. I want to just touch on the other questions we've received really quickly. So Catherine, you were wondering about creative ways of providing support in low resource settings. And I think that's really key. And my thoughts on that go towards, first of all, the fact that building that community around disabled learners in low resource settings is probably going to be the most successful thing that I could think of. If I think, for example, about your context in Rwanda, mostly somewhere in a disabled young person's life, there will be one or two people who understand that person's disability and who are already allies and helpers. And you're looking to make sure the teacher sort of joins in with that group, and that there's kind of a little set of folks around this child who can adapt and provide creative ways to use these ideas, which admittedly are, for the moment, pretty westernized in the toolkit. They're not always context adapted. The toolkit is your starting point for undertaking an adaptation. And so if you can build that community around the learner, then you can start looking for what those adaptations are going to look like in your low resource context. And in yesterday's session, Anne actually gave a great example around transportation, where, you know, here, of course, in the sort of more resourced school districts in the US, we would have school buses with ramps, and it would be possible to wheel a wheelchair onto a school bus. And Anne had a little picture of a school bus with a ramp and a child in a wheelchair getting herself on the school bus. That's not really probably going to happen in rural Rwanda. But maybe people can put a little bit of money together to figure out how to pay somebody who has a flatbed truck to let the child put their wheelchair on the flatbed truck and then be transported to school that way. So you will need to do those local adaptations. And my bet is, although again, this work is very young, my bet is that in a lot of cases that's going to come from building community around the particular learner that you're trying to assist. So that's what I'll say about that. And then I'm conscious of time, but I know that we have a couple more questions. So Bart in Guatemala, hello. You wanted to know how we can support teachers to thrive in this kind of approach. Well, that's going to take, I hate to be the bearer of terrible news, that's going to take some time and money. You're going to need to program money behind it, and you're going to need to become their helpmate for a good set of years. None of us learn something overnight that's new in our careers or our jobs. And what we're asking of teachers here is not insignificant. You're asking them to be great literacy teachers, even more so again than they were before. And so you're going to have to really provide the coaching, provide the training, provide the support, provide the phone-in helpline or the text messaging system or whatever it takes in your context to accompany them on this journey, and to also set out reasonable expectations from the start. Again, this toolkit is over 100 pages of great ideas to spur thought. It's not a one-off recipe for your context. So the first thing to do is to start a program that aspires to follow some or all of what is written in the toolkit, and then really focus on the adaptation of what's in this chapter 3, so that teachers where you are can make small, steady changes and small, steady progress in terms of what they're doing to employ and bring to life the UDL framework in their classrooms.
Oh, can I add on that real quick? Just UDL is the instructional approach. It is the instructional approach that helps all kids. So if you see it as that, we've done a lot of work on, you know, content and literacy. It's time to also look at how we deliver this in the classroom. And this is the method that is seen as the best way to deliver. And where I've seen when we've started working with teachers, they're doing a lot of this on their own, so build on what they have. They're happy to be able to do instruction in a way that helps all kids. And I think I would see it in that lens as well.
And then from Denise in Nigeria, a long comment in the chat box about how teachers really do have we do work with very challenged teachers in many contexts, because they themselves never benefited from what they genuinely needed to become masters of the craft. And so now we're asking them to add another dimension to their thinking and to their practice, and yet they struggle with some of the most basic things we've ever asked of them. Of course, also in your context, and I lived there for years, Denise, they struggle. There are a lot of linguistic struggles in Nigeria that make things very difficult as well. Most Nigerian teachers don't, except for the South, don't have a command of English that allows them to actually dispense the curriculum that they're confronted with from the NERDC. So they are in a tight spot, these teachers. And I really think that from a USAID standpoint, what we're going to need is a lot of sort of flexible design and co-creations that hang on to the bottom lines we're trying to present here, right? So for one, we do know a lot about how literacy is best taught, and we need to hang on to those principles when we design something, and we need to ask implementing partners to really respect them. And then, as Anne is saying, we know that Universal Design for Learning is a framework for organizing all of your work in education and in your classroom in a way that's beneficial both to students with disabilities and to those without disabilities. And so when we're designing a new program, we need to say, literally, and Josh will get into this in a moment, we're procuring a program that will use the Universal Design for Learning framework presented in the Universal Design for Learning toolkit, and we want your best ideas about what you think we should start with the Nigerian teacher core that we have. And it could be as simple, it really could be as simple as changing just a few things about modes of engagement, or a few things about modes of communication, or a few things about assessment protocols. You don't have to do it all at once, but we are all sort of compelled under the new USAID policy to start somewhere. And the toolkit is such a vast set of good ideas that if we fund a partner to go through it, read it, and come up with the top 3 they want to work on in Nigeria, then we should probably let that program be funded and play out so that we can get the learning from that about how that can really work in the Nigerian context. So that's what I'd have to say to Nigeria. Turn it back over to Josh so that he can move us into the next portion of the session.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So now as we start discussions, we've already talked about many different things related to this toolkit, the different chapters, but this actually isn't a chapter that's in the toolkit. It's more of what we have been discussing on how we can plan and implement this toolkit in different USAID projects and processes. That's the reason why that we're here, right? So before we start this slide, I really wanted to frame the UDL as something that we can use as a tool in 2 different ways. One, we really can use the tool as a system shift in how we can teach and provide education. As Denise's point was, yes, we are going to have low capacity teachers, but at least those low capacity teachers, you'll be able to expose them to different ways of teaching and learning and different ways of expressing and communicating. So when the time comes in those classrooms, they're not stuck and they're thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. There's actually going to have some suggestions and they have learned it before and they're just maybe not sure how to do it, but they're not going to be there'll be less of a stigma. So we want to decrease that. And we already know that education systems themselves transform. When we think about our own education system here in the United States, I mean, 1900s till now, I mean, wow, there's a lot of transformation. And it's going to continue to transform. So the UDL framework can actually offer that system shift. And also, we can use it as a tool on how you can actually watch where your education systems are now, and you can see where you are right now and where the gaps are, so that you should maybe invest. For example, many countries, their training of teachers are really good at Braille or sign language or using specific technologies for AAC communication technologies, or maybe they're weak, or maybe they don't have those. So maybe in those instances, you can invest in that and you can build that up for the future. So we want to offer those as approaches and ways that we can use this toolkit. So how can we use this toolkit meaningfully during our PAD design and implementation, our evaluation, learning, and CDCS processes? Because all of these things are very critical points for the work that we do. And the answers are, look at the toolkit. You can look at the design in the different areas. Another tool that you should consider using is through processes of reading matters framework. And Rebecca, their team, designed this beautiful photo. And really, if you can look at all of the educational systems within there, and it's related to mentoring, administrating, teaching, text, you'll see within that circle, and you will actually find different things within that toolkit that can actually be placed in this. So between both of those resources, it can really help you think through your literacy projects and design and how it can actually apply to the CDCS. First, you can one of the first things that you could do in your analysis is have two kinds of analysis. One, you can a general analysis, maybe using, for example, literacy landscape assessments, or another kind of literacy assessments. And then important that you actually include that in that type of assessment, these specific questions related to disabilities. And they have some examples here, like if a boy or girl with a disability or without a disability, do they have equal opportunities for language and literacy skills? Have strategies in place to make sure that it's a fair chance for students with percentage of boys and girls with or without disabilities. For example, those sample questions you can actually insert in what you already currently have as your assessments. And it will actually give you information about these disabilities and how it can actually apply to the assessments. But on the other side, sometimes maybe you already have finished your assessments, you're like, ooh, I didn't include those disability points, what am I going to do? Or maybe you want to go deep down and get more information regarding disabilities or disability-specific programs, and maybe you need to go more in depth, and that's where you can actually do, it's not mandatory disability-focused assessments, but more specific assessments. And that analysis can actually give you a lot of rich information from here on out in your design and your programming. So another point that's very critical is to include local actors, specifically, at the implementation level. Make sure that you interact with the students that have the disability themselves, because they are the ones who are trying to impact. So you want to improve their learning outcomes. And yesterday we did discuss a little bit about the IEP, the individual education plan. So I just want to let you know here that in the United States, we've seen this shift on how the IEPs are actually run. Before, it was more focused on parents, teachers, other service providers that were discussing the students' needs, and the students would just sit there and not really be involved. And then everyone above them would make these decisions. But now the shift is now to actually try to get the students more engaged in what their decisions are and what their needs are. And with that concept, it actually applies to our project too, our program. We're trying to extend the possibilities. And I know it's hard for us at USA level, but the implementing partners can actually work with these students and discuss with these children that have the disabilities and get their input on what's best for them. Also include their parents as part of that process. Next as well, children and their experiences. They are children. They're not adults yet, but maybe they're not fully able to express what their experiences and their needs are. And that's why they'll have their parents there. But another way that we can get that information and the experiences, we can ask the adults that have disabilities and ask them at the DPO, the disabled people organizations that you can get involved with. Those adults already went through this educational experience and systems, and they have a lot of rich knowledge that they can actually provide to include these ways to which maybe that they would want to see something different. So I recommend that you contact them. I'm sure all of the work can be aligned with the CRPD. The more that you can actually include the community and the end user, then the better the program and the more lasting that program will be. While we're doing the site visits, you can actually get different parts of checklists. You can use things, do's and don'ts, for example, and then you can actually bring that with you while you're on your site visits and check and see if these things are happening. Are children benefiting from this literacy activities? You can look at Chapter 3, how the projects better support children with disabilities more holistically. In Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, you can actually look at different identifications during your visit. And also in Chapter 2.5, you can look at the DPO. Is it good? Are they included in these projects all the way through, or just parts? Also, you can look at other more high-level disability inclusive education tools and their do's and don'ts, and that's also on the EduLinks. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca now, and she's going to explain the rest of the presentation.
Hi, thanks, Josh. So these are things you've maybe been thinking about already on the webinar, but just a few slides to remind you. So we do a lot of writing activity descriptions at USAID, and we'd like to encourage, in as much as possible, that these activity descriptions be pretty specific about including children and youth with disabilities. And we don't mean what we've been doing for the last 20 years. We mean actually speaking much more explicitly in the activity description or the statement of work or the PD that you're putting with a procurement about where and who and how and what in terms of the population of disabled learners that you're hoping to reach with your money, about hoping to reach them through the application of the UDL principles in the toolkit, and about being pretty explicit about building their actual literacy skills, because we're not here only to create a room and a space somewhere in a country where people with disabilities are somehow sitting with others who don't have those particular disabilities. That's a very old idea about inclusion that we are really working to completely abandon. We're here to be sure that children with disabilities can acquire the foundational skills they need to succeed in schooling and in academics and in their career path. And so as much as we can write activity descriptions that call explicitly for that, and that reference this toolkit as a way to begin that work, and adapting that toolkit as a way to begin that work, that's what we're hoping to be able to make progress on, depending on country and context. So in terms of the external evaluations of our programs, these are always great learning opportunities, but they're also challenging design tasks. We have to be really intentional about the way we design our external evaluations. And what we'd like to all start working on more is requiring in those external evaluations targeted questions around the learning services provided to children with disabilities. So not just how has the program actually functioned to build learning outcomes, but vis-a-vis children with disabilities and even vis-a-vis children with specific kinds of disabilities. How has this program either succeeded or not succeeded in moving the bar in terms of their learning and their skills? Not in terms of whether they're coming to the same cafeteria or whether they're getting on the same cart to come to school, but are they actually getting a chance to learn and build their skills and express themselves and grow? And then are the materials that are being made available with all of the money that we're spending in various contexts, either crisis affected or not, are these materials fully accessible to children with a wide range of disabilities? And I know I'm setting a high bar. I know that we sometimes have achieved that, we sometimes have not. I myself have worked on programs that have sometimes achieved that and sometimes not. But this toolkit and this webinar and this work and our new education policy are all an opportunity to do much, much more to be sure that we're doing that every time and that every evaluation that we have of a program looks explicitly at that question. Are all of the inputs listed in the Reading Matters framework sufficiently adapted and sufficiently multimodal to meet the sort of expectations of the UDL framework and to serve as broad a set of disabled learners as possible. Then, obviously, as we're writing our solicitations, there are lots of things we can do. So we do have ADS 302 and 303. So this is a mandatory, the ADS is something we all have to make our programming conform to. And so this provides a handy mandatory reference to the USAID disability policy that you can pass right on to that contractor or that grantee, because once it's in their award document, then they absolutely must do it. So making sure that that's there. Making sure that it's not, that the discussion around learners with disabilities is not just that paragraph at the end that we put in to pass the SOAR or whatever the ARAD used to be or so on and so forth, but that it's there because you really need the program to leverage this toolkit and serve those children. And then we have some examples here in terms of things that you can write in or think about. But, you know, what are the differential gaps in learning for boys and girls with disabilities and without disabilities? What are the specific barriers to literacy experienced by specific disabled student populations? What's the legal framework in the country around supporting disability inclusive education? What are the gaps between policy and practice? And what are you asking an implementer to do to shorten or narrow those gaps? And then you can also, obviously, when you're writing your section L or M, you can make disability and inclusion a scoring criteria, but only do that if you've actually written an RFP or an SOO or a program description that requires respondents to actually address those issues as well. So try to be fair and balanced in terms of placing the expectation out there for the partner community and then scoring against it when you get to your scoring.
I also wanted to add one thing on this slide. In disability inclusive education, as to know, is we also have some examples of language that you can take from there. So it will actually help you. So you can use both of those, and you can add those words in the EduLink in the disability topic areas. It's already there, and you can use that. Go ahead and look that up and make it available.
And shout out to countries that have already done solicitation documents in this spirit, right? So Bangladesh, Cambodia, Malawi, Nepal, and many others, we hope, already have documents that are built around these ideas, and I'm sure they wouldn't mind you taking a look if you just send a little email and ask. So obviously your award kickoff, this is, I'm sure, occurred to you already. But when you meet with your newly funded partner, this is a great opportunity to review the disability inclusion requirements that you've wanted to build into your program, to talk to them about the Universal Design for Learning Toolkit, to make sure they know that they need to download it and start thinking about it, and to really go through with them in some detail how their work is going to impact and improve learning for disabled learners of any age, in any situation in which they find themselves crisis affected or not. And then, logically, the agreement documents or anything that is signed or any part of the program description that's incorporated by reference into any award, you want to be sure that the disability inclusive language there and the language about building literacy learning or building skills learning for learners with disabilities is very strong. So that you can actually do things like require a disability inclusion implementation plan. This could happen. You could require disability specific or disability disaggregated performance indicators in an MEL plan. And these are things that set your partner up for success because it really brings to life in a clear and concrete way your expectation for the partner about the inclusion of people with disabilities in the learning process and in skills building, not just in the spaces where we all live our public lives. And then when successes happen, clearly, always great to have communications about them. And so you've got some lovely examples here from Paraguay, from Malawi, just the opportunity that we have as the USAID staff and in our USAID missions to really begin producing a corpus of announcements and celebrations about including people with disabilities in our programs, but also structuring programs so that people with disabilities have learning opportunities that they need to build their skills. And I think Josh wants to come in here.
In the middle picture, they have something called Disability Communication Tips. It's developed by people who work in disability here in the agency, including Leah online. So thank you so much, Leah, for developing this wonderful resource. It looks at providing different ways of how to positively communicate with people that have disabilities and how we can share information to the world. So it's also on EduLink. So just wanted to give her a plug. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. Fantastic resource. So overall, as you can see, we have lots of opportunity moving forward to really go to the next level in terms of all of our processes in USAID vis-a-vis organizing, evaluating, implementing, and sort of in general learning from programs that are very clear and specific about using the Universal Design for Learning framework and the toolkit that Anne has been so kind to produce to really benefit and build the skills of children and learners or youth and learners with disabilities. So that's the end of this presentation, and I'm going to pass it over to Josh to carry us home here.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Now I'm actually curious from the participants, some of your initial thoughts. How can we use this toolkit? What do you envision? How can it apply to your programs from here on out? Can you actually type in the chat box? We're really curious about what your thoughts are moving forward. Somebody actually said, I think it's a good resource to use for people here in Washington to actually go to these deep, when they go on their different missions. That's really good. Thank you, Leah. Catherine says, it gives a lot of ideas about how you can potentially plan your next phase of design. That's great. Any other thoughts? Nora also says that it will help in the next design phase. Bart says it's going to be a good resource to work on with the IPs and the projects. We have another question that we would like to give to you, and it's something that we here have been really thinking about a lot in Washington. When we developed this toolkit with Anne, our team actually, we are aware there's a lot of information in this toolkit that doesn't really encompass a whole and can't apply to all programs in USAID. So we're actually curious of any missions. Are you thinking about piloting this toolkit, possibly? Any interest in doing this? Just want to see what's out there.
Yeah, Bart, that's a great comment. Sorry, I was trying to scroll down to see what you had said. So yes, you're right. There are examples in the toolkit from missions and programs, both USAID funded and also from some countries where things were happening that weren't USAID funded. But they're really great examples and kind of give a flavor of what it's truly like to try to advance this agenda in the field. I wanted to come in on Josh's last question about piloting the toolkit and explain just a bit about what that might look like. So if there are missions that are interested in actually piloting this document in a sort of more structured way, what that would mean is that you'd be willing to put in some team time to working with Josh to look at how the toolkit could be introduced to the implementing partners in your environment in maybe some webinar like this that he and I could hold for your IPs and for your ministry if you want, and for your DPO. We'd adapt this webinar for that. And then we'd actually, in the course of working with them and talking with them, we'd ask for specific steps they could take based on what they would know and learn about the toolkit. And then what we'd try to do together working with you is to follow up on that application, whatever small thing they had committed to try to see what sort of change or impact that might have. So when Josh says, is there anyone out there willing to quote unquote pilot this, that's what we mean. Is there anybody willing to work with him and our team here to introduce this in a more explicit way to your implementing partner community, and then try to get some small action steps from that we could then evaluate in terms of their utility for disabled learners in your context. I just wanted to explain that. So with that explanation, can you type in the chat box if you'd be willing to go through some sort of mini pilot like that with Josh. Thanks.
Catherine, yes, that would be great. We would share that toolkit with Soma, your implementing partner. Yes, we would be definitely willing to share that with them. It'll be very beneficial. And the workshop. Great. Thank you all. I just also wanted to let you know that there's an opportunity for any last questions. Anyone maybe have something, a one-off, or maybe even a comment before we start to wrap up. Is there anything else anybody would like to say? Okay, great. It seems like we don't have any other additional comments. That will be fine. I just want to say how much I really appreciate all of your time that you had spent this morning. Thank you so much. Thanks to Rebecca and Anne and all of our colleagues. Oh, somebody did the URC.
Great.
Thank you for the support.
Bart.
And Bart. And thank you, Bart, for being open to exploring options with USAID. I think that's really great. And thank you all again for taking your time for our webinar today. And I hope that, I know it was a lot of information and we barely scratched the surface. There is a lot more. But we are here as a resource at E3 Education. Rebecca, Leah, myself, and other people in the E3 Education partners for disability. We want to spread this out here. And so feel free to contact us anytime. And if you want to contact other missions as well, maybe you're not sure who the best fit is for your context, you can ever actually ask us, and we will give you recommendations on other missions that you can contact. Because we all are a team and we're going to try to make this a reality. And remember the EduLinks. There's a wealth of information there as well, and you can find the toolkit on there. All right, thanks so much. Anything else, Rebecca? Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everyone.